The ranch smelled of dust and copper as I parked by the busted gate and checked my recorder, and Rosa Delgado said, "Whatever did this was no coyote." Dr. Miguel Reyes knelt by the pen and said, "2 punctures, blood loss, no tearing, it's surgical." I logged the angle of the marks and said, "Patterns matter more than panic." Rosa stared at the mesquite line and said, "It took the smallest ones first, like it knew me." The generator coughed, and a light stuttered across corrugated tin, and I remembered a file that warned of copycats. My phone chimed and Professor Harold Voss said, "Close the case, Alex, folklore wastes grants." I watched mosquitoes halo my lens and said, "Data can be born in folklore." A truck idled on the road, and Nadia Cole said, "I can get you access if you keep things quiet." Miguel slipped a glove and said, "No saliva froth, no drag marks, this is staged or strange." Far off, a shape crossed the ridge, and Rosa whispered, "It comes when the wind dies." The wind died, and I said, "Tonight we log everything." Morning peeled the sky open above the diner, and the coffee tasted like scorched hope while I replayed last night's audio. Miguel stirred sugar and said, "Predators take, but they do not tidy." I sketched the wound geometry and said, "We chart anomalies, not fears." Rosa slid a ledger across the table and said, 3 seasons, the same week, the same moon." Trucks hissed by the window, and a radio jingle hid a nervous tremor in her voice. Miguel rubbed his temples and said, "If this is staged, someone knows veterinary basics." I traced supply routes on a highway map and said, "Movement defines motive." The waitress topped us off and said, "You folks chasing the vampire goat thing?" Rosa looked away and said, "We chase what killed trust." My phone chimed again, and Voss said, "Drop it, Alex, your credentials are at risk." I watched the steam curl and said, "Credentials measure access, not truth." Miguel tapped the ledger and said, "Then we start with this pattern." The county archive smelled like old glue and thunderstorms, and the librarian slid a stack of clippings toward me with a practiced sigh. Nadia appeared between shelves and said, "Our outlet can syndicate if you keep it tame." Miguel flipped a report and said, "Photos are missing from the earliest cases." I held a microfilm frame to the light and said, "Patterns repeat until someone interrupts them." A thunderhead grumbled over town, and lights flickered like tired eyelids. Nadia typed a message and said, "The university will deny you access if you push." The fax machine coughed ink, and a faded affidavit showed 2 precise wounds in looping script. Miguel tapped the margin and said, "Language carries habits." I filed the line into memory and said, "Habits betray authors." Nadia leaned closer and said, "Be careful who owns your evidence." The storm cracked, and I heard the shelves creak like old ribs. Dusk returned like a verdict as we set a thermal camera by the cedar post and waited for the field to breathe. Miguel checked the recorder and said, "Battery drain was real." I scanned the ridge and said, "Silence is a kind of footprint." The mesquite rattled once and went still, as if the land was holding its breath. A figure stepped from the fence line and Silas Crow said, "You're listening, not hearing." Miguel stiffened and said, "You are trespassing." Silas tipped his hat and said, "Tracks run where water once ran." I tasted dust and said, "Who are you warning, us or it?" He scratched a line in the dirt and said, "Follow the dry creek when the dogs stop barking." Coyotes fell quiet, and I marked the map while the horizon swallowed the final strand of light. The roadside shrine flickered with votive candles and plastic flowers, and a torn ribbon hummed against the cross as trucks roared past. I set the mic on the gravel and said, "Marisol Vega vanished on this curve after feeding goats." Miguel set a cone of light on the ditch and said, "No skid marks, just footprints that stop." A shrike called from the fence, and the sound sharpened the air like a blade. My phone lit with a voicemail, and Evan Mercer said, "Turn back before you turn into Dad." I closed my eyes and said, "History is a mirror if you stand too close." Wind dimpled the puddle, and it reflected a warped moon that looked too calm to judge us. Miguel steadied the tripod and said, We follow the creek at dawn. I capped the mic and said, truth is a path cut by refusal. The shrine candle guttered once, then steadied like a breath we were borrowing. The creek bed stretched empty, stones like bones under the noon glare, and Miguel traced the ground with his boot. He said, no water, but tracks follow memory. Rosa stood back and said, my uncle swore this creek whispered names when dry. I crouched with the thermal scope and said, residual heat where no body moved. Nadia shaded her eyes and said, could be a staged trail, Alex. I flicked the scope and said, heat leaves echoes, not fakes. Miguel set down a marker and said, prints deepen near the bend, as if weight doubled. The cicadas screamed until the silence felt sharper than their noise. Rosa pressed a palm to her ledger and said, each year animals vanish where this creek turns. I mapped the bend and said, patterns spiral toward emptiness. Nadia crossed arms and said, or toward myth. The horizon shimmered, and the sun felt heavier with each step. The barn reeked of mildew and rust, beams sagging like ribs, and Miguel swept his flashlight across clawed wood. He said, no predator claws this neat. Rosa pulled a chain shut and said, my father said locks failed when it came. I traced the gouges and said, angles are consistent, height near 5 feet. Nadia snapped a photo and said, could be staged with tools. Miguel frowned and said, but why repeat marks year after year? A mouse skittered, making Rosa gasp, and her rosary rattled like loose teeth. I said, fear imprints its own graffiti. Nadia lowered the camera and said, fear sells too. The dust swirled under Miguel's breath, and the barn creaked like it wanted to confess. I logged every angle while outside. The wind bent grass in waves that never touched the barn. The sheriff's office hummed with tired fans and faded flags, and Sheriff Dalton tapped his pen against the desk. He said, folklore won't fill reports. Miguel leaned forward and said, reports omit what frightens patterns. I slid a photo of punctured goats across the desk and said, data speaks when ink stays silent. Dalton rubbed his jaw and said, cattlemen need answers, not ghost stories. Rosa whispered, ghosts need answers too. Nadia crossed her legs and said, the press will paint whatever sells best. Dalton's eyes hardened and he said, then my county sells safety, not monsters. The fan clicked like a countdown, and the room held its heat. Miguel wrote coordinates, and I said, safety without truth is only silence. Dalton shoved the paper back and said, then chase your silence outside my office. The night field buzzed with static from the parabolic mic as I tuned the gain, and Miguel said, we bait silence, not sound. Rosa lit a lantern and said, light invites both friend and foe. Nadia rolled her eyes and said, or raccoons. The grass leaned flat, as if pressed by invisible hands. I whispered, pattern emerges in pressure. Miguel adjusted the scope and said, no animal mass fits this weight. The horizon pulsed with distant heat lightning, and Rosa crossed herself. She said, it waits when storms gather. The mic clicked, capturing a low hiss too rhythmic for wind. I stiffened and said, that is breath, not weather. Nadia's smirk faltered, and she said, or feedback. The hiss rose once, then vanished, leaving only crickets stunned into silence. We spread notes across the motel bedspread patterned with wilted roses, and Miguel said, each site marks a spiral inward. I traced the map and said toward the old reservoir. Rosa set her ledger down and said, that place drowned families when it filled. Nadia typed on her phone and said, or drowned stories made to scare. Miguel rubbed his brow and said, every path curves back to water. A neon sign flickered through the blinds, painting the room in false dawn. I said, water hides what earth rejects. Rosa whispered, and remembers what earth forgets. Nadia scoffed, but her fingers trembled on the phone. Miguel circled the reservoir with red ink and said, that is where it begins again. The night pressed close, and silence felt like a verdict. The reservoir sat like a bruise under the fading sky, And Miguel said, water holds more secrets than earth. Nadia snapped a photo and said, it's just stagnant history. I traced the shoreline with my recorder and said, history speaks when it rots. Rosa hugged her ledger and said, my cousin drowned here chasing lights no one else saw. A heron startled, wings cracking air, and silence dropped like a curtain. I leaned close to the water and said, temperature spike, not natural. Miguel frowned and said, electrical interference or something pulsing. Nadia shook her head and said, every mystery is just noise magnified. Rosa whispered, then why does noise feel like hunger? Inside the library basement, the air stank of mold and iron, and Miguel said, these records survived the flood. I opened a folder and said, no copies, only fragments. Rosa whispered, they kept deaths off the books. Nadia scrolled her phone and said, convenient conspiracy sells faster than truth. I touched brittle paper that read, unknown animal attacks, margins burned with water stains. Miguel said, language repeats, surgical precision. Rosa crossed herself and said, my uncle told me they buried livestock at night to keep whispers quiet. I said, silence here is curated. Nadia smirked and said, or invented. The church bells cracked midnight air, and Silas Crow stood by the gate, saying, you read paper, I read soil. Miguel tensed and said, you trespass again. Silas said, the ground shifts where lies are heavy. I said, then guide me to where weight is strongest. Rosa whispered, don't follow him, Alex. Nadia smirked, of course the outsider has clues. Silas drew a circle in dust and said, what you hunt feeds on forgetting. Miguel muttered, or feeds on folklore. The bells echoed until they felt like heartbeats, and I said, truth is buried under both. The diner buzzed empty at closing, neon humming weakly, and Professor Voss slid into the booth, uninvited. He said, Alex, close this before it ruins you. I said, truth doesn't ruin, it reveals. Miguel bristled, you're the one burying reports. Voss smirked and said, funding flows to silence, not chaos. Nadia leaned in and said, and headlines flow to chaos. Rosa whispered, this is the keeper of secrets. Voss tapped the table and said, secrets are ballast, not poison. I said, then, why do they sink every survivor? Silence hung like grease on the window, thicker than smoke. The motel lot stank of oil and rain, and Nadia handed me a flash drive saying, these files fell off a truck. Miguel frowned, or were planted. I said, truth doesn't care where it leaks from. Rosa shifted uneasily and said, poison leaks too. I plugged it in, screen flickering with redacted reports stamped confidential. Miguel muttered, military tags, same phrasing as livestock cases. Nadia smirked and said, secrets keep their handwriting. I whispered, then someone already studied the same wounds. Rosa said, and someone kept them hidden. The rain thickened, and silence pressed harder than thunder. The cemetery sagged beneath storm clouds, and Rosa knelt at a cracked headstone, whispering her cousin's name. Miguel said, records omit her, but grief remembers. I pressed the recorder close and said, tragedy leaves marks deeper than stone. Nadia leaned against a gatepost and said, or deeper than gullibility. Rosa's voice broke. Marisol believed the lights meant safety. The thunder rumbled, echoing like hollow drums. Miguel traced moss on the stone and said, the flood drowned more than bodies, it drowned testimonies. I said, silence is curated when tragedy is inconvenient. Rosa turned, tears shining, and said, pain is not convenient, it is eternal. Nadia lowered her gaze, unease replacing cynicism. The town hall archive smelled of damp varnish and guilt, and Miguel pulled a folder marked reservoir relocation. I said, these pages bleed omissions. Rosa whispered, families erased when water rose. Nadia smirked and said, tragedy feeds rumors. Miguel flipped a page and said, 2 livestock deaths tied to a drowned settlement. I traced underlined words and said, they buried the story with the town. Rosa's hand trembled as she said, "My aunt vanished in that flood." Nadia lowered her phone and said, "Even I won't print that lightly." Thunder rattled windows, and dust fell like ash from the ceiling. We returned to the reservoir shore where lanterns cast pale halos, and Rosa traced the waterline with her finger. She said, "The drowned settlement lies below." Miguel set a probe and said, "Anomalous readings spike under the surface." Nadia crossed arms and said, "Spikes are noise until proven pattern." I leaned forward and said, "Patterns persist when fear repeats." Rosa whispered, "I hear voices here." Thunder cracked, lightning illuminating her pale face. Miguel muttered, "Magnetism rising, instruments unreliable." I said, "Or someone wants them unreliable." Nadia's smirk faltered as ripples stirred without wind, and silence fell heavier than rain. Inside Rosa's home, framed photos leaned crooked, and she poured coffee with trembling hands. She said, "Every loss here circles back to the same week." Miguel unfolded maps and said, "The cycle is undeniable." Nadia tapped her phone and said, "Cycles mean nothing without proof." I held up the recorder and said, "Proof begins with consistency." Rosa's eyes wet, she whispered, "My brother vanished before harvest." Miguel closed his eyes and said, "Tragedy drives the pattern harder than myth." Nadia looked at Rosa's photos and said, "Even I can't dismiss your grief." The storm rattled the windows, shaking the house like a breath. The storm cleared to a brittle dawn as we stood at the dry creek bed, and Rosa carried a photo of her brother. She said, "He was only 16 when he vanished." Miguel said, "The pattern tightens, always at the creek." I said, "Tragedy is the axis of this spiral." Nadia shifted uncomfortably and said, "What if grief builds its own monster?" Rosa's voice shook. "Grief doesn't drink goats dry." Miguel pressed his pen hard into the map and said, "Truth rests on tragedy, not superstition." I whispered, "And tragedy anchors monsters, real or invented." The morning wind carried silence heavy with loss. The courthouse steps glistened with rain as Professor Voss blocked my path, his voice low. He said, "Alex, end this before you drown in it." Miguel stiffened and said, "You fear exposure more than danger." Voss smiled coldly. "Truth ruins institutions, not monsters." I said, "Truth ruins those who bury it." Rosa clutched her ledger and whispered, "He knows the missing names." Nadia raised an eyebrow and said, "Convenient for him to appear now." Voss tapped his cane. "You chase myths, I guard civilization." I felt the weight of his words and said, "Civilization built on lies collapses louder." The abandoned schoolhouse creaked under our steps, chalk dust hanging like ghosts. Miguel ran a finger over carved desks and said, "Children studied here while livestock vanished." I scanned graffiti on the walls and said, "Folklore leaves stains in wood." Rosa whispered, "My brother learned letters here before he was gone." Nadia snapped a photo and said, "Perfect for headlines." Miguel frowned, "Not headlines, patterns." I found a ledger wedged under a floorboard and said, "Names scratched out, deliberate omission." Rosa trembled. "Every erased name is another grave." The silence inside pressed harder than the storm outside. At the radio tower, wind howled through guy wires, and Miguel tapped his scanner. He said, "Something scrambles signals here." Nadia shouted over static, "Noise is everywhere." I said, "This is controlled interference." Rosa clutched her coat and whispered, "The night my cousin disappeared, radios went dead." Miguel's screen flickered with bursts of rhythmic static, and he muttered, "Not random, patterned." I said, "Noise becomes voice when decoded." Nadia frowned, "Or when imagined." The tower lights blinked red, like warnings in the fog. Rosa whispered, "Warnings no one listened to." The ranch corral lay shattered, wood splintered, and Miguel crouched by a carcass. He said, "Again, 2 punctures. Blood drained, no struggle." Rosa whispered, "Like when I was a child." Nadia raised her camera and said, "This sells fear faster than truth." I said, "Truth doesn't need to sell, it survives." Miguel's voice shook, but this is not human. Rosa clutched her rosary, muttering prayers. Nadia lowered her camera and said, "Even I feel watched." I whispered, "Because we are." A shadow moved along the fence line, vanishing before words could catch it. The motel room reeked of coffee and exhaustion, papers scattered like confessions. Miguel tapped the map and said, "Every path spirals back to the reservoir." I said, "Then the center is truth or trap." Rosa whispered, "The dead call from water." Nadia paced and said, "Or secrets sink there because it's deep." Miguel muttered, "And silence drowns louder than screams." I leaned back and said, "Tomorrow we drag the reservoir floor." Rosa trembled, "And if it rises instead of sinks?" Nadia stopped pacing, unease cracking her mask. I whispered, "Then we face the keeper in its own depths." The reservoir shimmered under floodlights as boats idled, ropes creaking. Miguel said, "We'll drag the floor until we find something." Rosa clutched her rosary and whispered, "The drowned don't want to be touched." Nadia snapped photos, her tone sharp, proof or myth, the world is waiting. I steadied the recorder and said, "Truth waits at the bottom." The motor sputtered, and ripples spread like dark veins. Miguel muttered, "Magnetometers spiking again." Rosa's voice broke like the night he vanished. I stared into the dark water and said, "Secrets rise when silence cracks." Lightning flared across the horizon, splitting the night into fragments of fear. Chains groaned as the drag net scraped the bottom, and Miguel said, "Something's caught." Rosa whispered, "Don't pull it up." Nadia leaned forward and said, "This is the moment." I steadied my breath and said, "Every revelation cuts both ways." The winch strained, water churning black foam, and a bundle surfaced wrapped in tarp and wire. Miguel hissed, "Human remains." Rosa sobbed, "It's my cousin's ribbon." Nadia's voice faltered, "That's not folklore." I whispered, "The Chupacabra isn't just myth. It's mask." Thunder rolled like applause, and the night swallowed every answer we feared. The sheriff arrived with flashing lights, boots heavy on the dock. Dalton barked, "You've gone too far." Miguel snapped, "Too far is burying evidence." Voss stepped from the shadows and said, "I told you to walk away." Rosa shouted, "You erased her from records." Nadia whispered, "This is the story the world needs." I said the Chupacabra is a scapegoat for human crimes. Dalton's jaw tightened, "And your truth will tear this town apart." Voss smirked, "Better myths than murder trials." I held my recorder steady and said, "Better justice than silence." Back at the motel, the flash drive glowed in my laptop, revealing redacted reports. Miguel read aloud, "Test subjects drained of blood, classified." Rosa gasped, "So it was never a beast." Nadia whispered, "It was an experiment." I said, "The Chupacabra legend was camouflage." Miguel slammed the table, "They let families suffer to protect programs." Rosa's voice broke, "They let children vanish." Nadia shook her head and turned tragedy into folklore. I whispered, "Every lie fed the monster." The storm outside clawed the window, as if echoing the rage inside us. The night deepened as betrayal surfaced. Nadia whispered, "I knew more than I told you." Miguel glared, "You used us for your story." Rosa trembled, "You fed the keeper our steps." Nadia's eyes wet, "I wanted truth, but I was their informant." I said, "Then you chose secrets over justice." Voss's voice echoed from outside, "And she chose wisely." Miguel stepped forward, fury in his voice, "Your betrayal cost lives." Rosa clutched her chest and said, "You betrayed grief itself." I stared at Nadia and whispered, "Trust breaks louder than thunder." The storm broke into silence at dawn, mist crawling over the reservoir. Miguel whispered, "We stand at the threshold." Rosa clutched her photo and said, "My brother waits beneath." Nadia's voice cracked, "I never meant for it to go this far." Voss appeared on the dock, his cane striking wood, saying, "Truth destroys more than lies ever will." I said, Lies built this monster. The water rippled, reflecting our fractured faces. Miguel muttered, science explains scars, but not silence. Rosa whispered, silence buries the dead twice. I steadied the recorder and said, today, silence ends. The confrontation sharpened as Dalton arrived with deputies. He barked, this ends here. Miguel said, it ends when the truth is admitted. Rosa cried, my family's name's erased. Voss smirked, order requires sacrifice. Nadia shouted, sacrifice of lives, of truth. I raised the recorder, saying, the Chupacabra was your invention, to bury experiments and tragedies. Dalton's face twisted, better fear a beast than face our sins. Miguel's voice broke, science should reveal, not conceal. Rosa whispered, justice waits beneath. The dock groaned like a coffin lid, as thunder rumbled again. Chaos erupted as the tarp from the dredged remains split, bones spilling across the dock. Rosa screamed, it was never a beast. Miguel's voice shook, evidence confirms human hands. Voss snarled, you'll bury this or drown with it. Nadia shouted, no more silence. I said the Chupacabra was their mask, but the victims carry truth. Deputies faltered, their flashlights trembling. Dalton yelled, shut it down. Miguel said, you can't silence bones. Rosa knelt, pressing the photo to the remains, whispering, you are found. The air thickened with grief heavier than the storm. The deputies hesitated, eyes shifting as truth spread heavier than law. Voss hissed, order dies without secrets. I said, order dies without justice. Miguel raised the map and said, every disappearance aligns with human interference, not myth. Rosa whispered, then we mourn truth, not fear. Nadia cried, we broadcast this to the world. Dalton's voice cracked, you'll rip this town apart. I said, better torn open than buried alive? Lightning faded into soft dawn, as if the storm surrendered to the weight of revelation. Silence followed, not empty but complete. By full sunrise, the reservoir gleamed gold, its surface calm as if nothing had ever broken it. Miguel said softly, science will write this truth now. Rosa whispered, and grief will finally rest. Nadia lowered her phone, voice trembling. The world will know, even if it hates the truth. Voss limped away, muttering, you've doomed more than you saved. Dalton remained silent, staring at the water, broken. I said the Chupacabra lives only as a myth, but the victims live again in justice. The wind stirred gently, carrying the weight of secrets finally spoken.